Okay, this is Business 342. These are your workbook pages, not the questions, but the actual lecture part. This is page 70. Talking about portfolios, it just says portfolios is a collection of assets such as stocks, bonds held by an investor. It's generally not enough just to know the risk and return of an asset. You should also be aware of how this assets affect the risk and return of an overall portfolio. So portfolio is made up of different assets. The risk-return trade-off of a portfolio is measured by the portfolio's expected return. This is a weighted average of all the assets in the portfolio, and its standard deviation, which you have to figure out, where you always figure out the variance first, and then the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. The variance is standard deviation squared, so obviously the standard deviation is just the square root of the variance. But you have to figure out the variance to get the standard deviation. Okay, standard deviation is basically a measure of total risk. This is important. There's two parts to risk: systematic, and this says unsystematic. Systematic means things that affect every asset. For instance, if the economy goes into recession, that affects every asset, every company. Okay, so that's systematic. That's something that is the same risk more or less for everybody. The measure might be it might affect some companies less than others, but it's a risk that every company has. Unsystematic is risk that is particular to a certain industry or a certain company. Something happens that affects that company or affects that industry. You can get rid of unsystematic risk by diversification, which means having a portfolio of more than one asset. So the typical portfolio in the S&P 500 has, for instance, a standard deviation of 0.2, whereas the individual stock has a standard deviation of 0.9. The reason that an individual stock has a much higher than like the S&P 500 is because you've diversified with 500 stocks. So they each have unsystematic risks to each company and companies within a specific industry, but some are good risks, some are bad risks. So this tends to even itself out, zero itself out the more you diversify. Systematic risk you can't diversify because it's things that affect the market overall. So when you talk about standard deviation, you're talking about total risk. When you talk about beta, which we'll talk about later on, that's systematic risk, how it affects a certain company. And I'll give you an example. If you go into a recession, something like a Mercedes-Benz dealer or Mercedes-Benz luxury cars are probably going to be affected much more than a grocery store that sells milk. People are still going to be buying milk during a recession. They're going to be cutting way back on Mercedes-Benz. So Daimler-Benz will be affected a lot more than Walmart. So even though it's got the same thing that's affecting it, a recession, it affects one company more than another, and that's why the betas vary. Okay, unsystematic you can diversify against. Okay, so my point is standard deviation is total risk, which is systematic and unsystematic. Beta is just a systematic risk that affects every company. Okay, and they'll talk about beta later. Portfolios are described by percentage investment in each asset. These are called portfolio weights. So a portfolio, expected return on a portfolio is a weighted average. And it just talks about here, two securities in portfolio have a combined value of 10,000 with 6,000 in IBM, 4,000 in GM. So 6 out of 10 is 0.6 in the weight and 0.4. You know how to do a weighted, how to figure out weights. So it says mean and the variance of a portfolio. Okay, so compute the portfolio return. So RP, that's a P, return on a portfolio, is the weight of the first asset times the return of the first asset plus the weight of the second asset times the return of the third asset, and so on and so forth, depending on how many you have. So all you do is the percentage weight times the return, percentage weight times the return, you add those up, and that's how you get an expected return on a portfolio. Okay, and so here shows just a chart of how they're doing it. Again, it talks about stock A is 60% weight, stock B is 40%, so 60 times 25 equals 15, 40 times 30 equals 27. That'll give you the portfolio return for when there's a boom, portfolio return when there's normal, portfolio return when there's an investment. So you add all three of those together, and that gets you your expected return. Okay. Now when you want to find out the variance is a formula like this. It says variance of portfolio is the return of 1 minus the expected return of the portfolio. This is like x minus mu squared, basically, how you're figuring out a variance. X minus mu, because the expected return becomes mu of the portfolio. So that's this number up here, 11.5. So the return of 1 minus the expected return of the portfolio squared times the probability of 1. We're talking about boom in this case. We'll call this 1, 2, and 3. Okay, plus the expected return of 2. Excuse me, the return of 2, which is 14% in this case. 14% minus 11.5 times the probability plus the expected return of 3, which is this is a minus 31%, squared times the probability, and then you add all those up and you get the variance. It's real important because they ask most of the times for the standard deviation. You got to figure out the variance first, obviously. Then you get the standard deviation, which is either the variance squared. I mean, the standard deviation squared is the variance, so you would take the square root of that. So 483.25 is the square root. I mean, 21.98, which is the standard deviation, is the square root of that. Okay, so that's page 70 in your workbook lecture.